Hey, special educators, I'm Jennifer from Positively Learning. Welcome to the Special Educators Resource Room. If you're like me, you're always looking for ways to save time and streamline your work. That's why this podcast was created, to give you the systems and solutions you need to get your time back. Tune in for tips, tricks, and tools that will help you manage your workload and make the most of your time. Whether you're brand new or experienced, all are welcome in the Special Educators Resource Room. Hey, special educators, it's Jennifer from Positively Learning. Let's talk about student data tracking. So this is a topic that I have been interested in for many years. If you've been following me, I did a huge presentation, I would say maybe 5 or 6 years ago, because I was into it. Now, I still am into it, but I have more experience and more knowledge, and I've heard from so many of you. And for this episode, I'd like to go into the many pros to using a student data tracking tool, but I also want to share some things to watch out for. Of course, these are based on my own experience, so be sure to reach out and give me feedback, ask questions, and let's continue the conversation. Let's define what exactly student data tracking can look and feel like. So, informal definition based on my own experience is that students are involved at some point in the data collection process. So whether it's the actual data collection that they're doing or the data is already tracked and they are analyzing the data. So most common examples I can think of is using some type of student data notebook or student data binder where students are seeing an assessment score. They may be putting that on a data tracking sheet like a bar graph and then reflecting on their progress. And it doesn't have to be just academic performance data. Students could be involved in taking attendance records, tracking their participation rates, and even their behavior, filling out the daily communication forms, taking ownership over that process. And of course, the end goal of any data collection system is to have this information so we can make better decisions. We can determine the next steps. And I think, my opinion, is that when students are involved in the process, this data is even more valid. There are many positive factors to consider with student data tracking. We just mentioned student ownership and increased engagement. Involving students in tracking their own data often brings about more accountability. And we can make better informed instructional decisions if you didn't already have a consistent data tracking system in place because you were trying to do it all. Well, now we've got some help and we can put a system in place where students are tracking their own data, whether it's weekly, every other week, or every month. This is actually where I started. I was looking for a better system. In my early days, I wrote IEP goals and objectives that they were sound as far as gathering knowledge on my students' progress, but they were so time consuming. So when I was assessing, whether it was weekly or every other week, and I wanted to do it that frequently because my students were young and things just changed quickly, it was a lot to keep up with. And I remember a day I was in the general education classroom polling a student one-on-one to do a quick, well, not so quick performance task. And the students were lining up for lunch. And I was trying to finish up this data point and I was sweating it out. Now, the student I was working with, a 6-year-old, she was smiling ear to ear. She just loved being assessed. It was just a lot of attention. She was having a great time. But I wasn't. I was feeling a lot of pressure to get this in before the class left and started walking down the hallway. And I was trying to hurry up the process. So you can imagine how great that data was. She wasn't taking it quite as seriously. I was taking it way too seriously. And I thought there just had to be a better way. So we kind of met in the middle. I started getting into the idea of student data tracking. Now, I was working with very young students, so I had to get pretty creative. We started off with more of a traditional data binder, different bar graphs. I made a huge collection. There's over 200 of them that are aligned with a K through 2 scope and sequence for the Gen Ed curriculum, but also my students' IEP goals and objectives. I'll be sure to put a link in the show notes so that you can check it out and check out the preview so you can see what these pages look like. They're very student friendly, lots of white space, enough room for my students to fill in their bar graphs, whether they're using crayons or markers. So we we did use those pages. We didn't necessarily build out notebooks because, again, there's over 200 of these pages. That would be hugely overwhelming. But instead, I was customizing them a bit and using them as individual sheets that we could just tuck into a folder in our seat sack. So maybe all of my students were working on math goals, but we had a different page for individual students that was aligned to just what they needed. Another year, I was pulling a small group in the Gen Ed classroom, inclusion classroom, and we were doing fact fluency. This is something that we all did grade level wide. So I was pulling a small group, and every day we did a fact fluency page. We called them sprints. And once a week, we would check in. I would pass out the smelly markers. We'd all grade them together, and then we would track our progress. So you could track this progress on a bar graph. And one huge benefit was that we would also reflect on the progress and set a goal for next time. Now, we're not just pulling a goal out like, oh, I got 9 right. Next week, I'll get 10. It wasn't an automatic goal like that, but we did reflect on how we did, what we could do better, and then we set the goal. So for fact fluency, it might be reviewing our strategies. Well, what strategy did you use? How did it go? Do you want to keep that strategy or should we try something else? And then we would set our goal. But what was fun in this fact fluency math group that I had, we also took our progress 3D. So we used Legos and we built towers that reflected our progress. So we had one of those Lego trays. I don't know what they're called. They're flat where you can build your Lego model on top of it. It stays secure. We had one of those, and I think we had one for addition, maybe one for subtraction, and we would add blocks to create towers that measured our progress. I'm sure you can imagine how invested my students were. In fact, that was another huge benefit of using student data tracking is my students were so proud and they wanted to show it off. Imagine an upcoming meeting with family, caregivers, and your students are presenting the data rather than you. And they are explaining what we did and what this means, and here's how I'm doing. One more creative idea, and this one I'm going to use a literacy example. So I often had goals and objectives with young students that were some type of word list, maybe a list to decode. I created sticker books. Now, they're not exactly books. They were more cards that I had on a 3-ring binder ring and that my students could flip like a flip book. And I'd have word lists with a little bit of space next to each word that they could put a sticker on. Maybe you've seen these online. And my students would have these in the resource room so they could always grab it to practice. So there was no idle time. If there was any free time, they could go grab one of these books. But I also used them to check in. So maybe once a week, I would check in with a few students, have them bring their sticker book over and read with me. And I could put a sticker next to words that they could accurately decode. Now, it wasn't one and done. I definitely spiraled back to make sure it was still secured. But my students absolutely loved this. And it wasn't always linear. It's not that we just read until we stopped. No, one card might have 5 words that had stickers next to them, 5 words that were not yet. And then the next page might have 2 stickered words and the rest are blank, but so on. It was great for me because there were times when I was sitting down to do a quick progress report, quarterly progress, IEP report cards, and I could just grab the stack of sticker books because I kept them in the resource room and just quickly flip through. 17 out of 20, 15 out of 20, 10 out of 20, and just grab some quick data points on how my students were doing. And they loved it. Those are just a few creative ideas that go beyond the data notebook. Now, my students tend to thrive on collecting data, and I thrived too because the data was actually being collected and I wasn't feeling quite as overwhelmed. However, there's a little bit of a progress trap with this. Because you have this system in place, it could turn into data overwhelm. If we feel it as adults, imagine how our students may feel. They may feel that excessive data collection and tracking might be very overwhelming. It also could be overwhelming on us because now we're getting so much data back. And is it all really necessary? Do we need to be collecting all of those data points every week? Think of it like work samples. We don't collect work samples on everything our students are doing, but instead we're picking and choosing what is really representative of their progress. Another consideration is your instructional time. I found using student data tracking to be a huge time saver because I was trying to do it all. But if this is something brand new, just collecting data on a weekly basis, that could actually cut into instructional time. I think it's worth it, but it's something to definitely consider and budget time wisely. And perhaps the biggest consideration is your students' well-being. How do they feel about this? Is this adding excessive emphasis and pressure and stress? I found that for the majority of my students, it was the opposite. They enjoyed it. They felt good. They were getting that feedback right away. But I will not say that was every student. I did notice that I had one student who was particularly hard on himself. And it was very devastating. He could see that his Lego tower was not as tall as he wanted it to be. Now, I didn't have him compete with others, so I thought, oh no, I've got this covered. This is going to be okay. But you know what? It really wasn't up to me, right? It was how he was feeling about it. That perhaps is one of the biggest considerations to keep in mind as you're thinking about setting this up. So maybe you're listening to this in the summer and you're thinking, okay, great. I've got these data trackers. I'm going to set up notebooks. Boom, we're ready to go. But what I would instead suggest is, yes, take a look at these, see how they align with what you already have planned. And then when you get to know your students, you'll know if it's the right decision or not. Hopefully it is, because I saw some great results, but only you're going to know that as you get to know your students. As with all things, there is a balance. And with regular reflection and feedback from students, you can determine how student data tracking is going to look for you. Let me know if you have any questions, and be sure to hop over to the show notes so that you can see examples of exactly what student data tracking can look like. Let me know if you have any questions, and I thank you so much for listening. Catch you next time. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'm dying to ask, what'd you think? Be sure to hit the follow or subscribe buttons so that you never miss an episode. You can find the show notes and links for everything mentioned in this episode at positivelylearningblog.com. See you next week for more special education solutions.